Imagine living in a rich, thriving city on the coast of Asia Minor. Trade, culture, and progress define your everyday life. But above all there is a foreign power, the mighty Persian Empire, which decides your life. Would you bow to this rule to maintain peace and security, or would you risk everything and rise up against it? This is exactly the decision the Ionians faced more than 2,500 years ago. Before we dive into this fascinating story together, I'm interested in your opinion. Would you have submitted or would you have become part of the uprising? Be sure to write it in the comments. If you are hooked by such historical stories and want to see more of them, then support the whole thing with a like and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss an episode. And now begins a story of courage, betrayal, and the beginning of a conflict that would change the world forever. Chapter 1: The World of the Ionians. The first rays of sunshine break over the coast of Asia Minor and bathe the cities of Ionia in a warm golden light. It is the beginning of a new day in a region that was one of the most vibrant and prosperous in the world at that time. Merchants open their stalls, fishermen pull their boats ashore, and the streets begin a bustle that sets the rhythm of life. Voices mingle with the clinking of ceramics, the call of merchants, and the soft murmur of the sea. Everything seems orderly, familiar, almost timeless. In cities such as Miletus, Ephesus, and Phocaea, a world of trade, knowledge, and cultural exchange is unfolding. These cities are not just simple settlements, but centers of progress. Their ports connect them to distant regions, from Egypt to the coasts of the Black Sea. Goods of all kinds, spices, metals, fabrics, and handicrafts, change hands here every day. But it is not only goods that are exchanged, but also ideas. Because Ionia is more than just an economic center. It is a place of thought. This is where people begin to look at the world differently. They ask questions that go beyond myths and look for explanations based on observation and logic. One of the best-known representatives of this new way of thinking is Thales of Miletus, who tries to explain natural phenomena no longer solely by divine action, but by fundamental principles. This way of thinking is revolutionary, and it is born right here, in the streets and schools of Ionia. However, despite all this progress, the identity of the Ionians remains closely linked to the Greek world. They speak the same language as the people in Athens or Sparta, worship the same gods, and tell each other the same stories about heroes and gods. Their temples are dedicated to the well-known deities. Their festivals are similar to those on the mainland, and their self-image is clear: they are Greeks. And yet they are different. Geographically, they are not in the heart of Greece, but on its edge, on the border to another world. Ionia is located on the west coast of Asia Minor, an area that has been shaped by different cultures for centuries. This location makes the region an intersection between East and West. This is where Greek traditions meet Oriental influences, where different ways of life merge into something new. This special position brings advantages, but also risks. The prosperity of the Ionian cities is based on their openness and their connection to other regions. But it is precisely this openness that makes them susceptible to external influences and political changes. As the cities flourish, a power is growing in the east that will soon extend its influence to the shores of Ionia. The Persian Empire. Under the leadership of Cyrus II, one of the largest empires of the time, emerged in the 6th century BC. With impressive speed, the Persians conquer one area after another. They defeat the Lydian Empire, which previously had control over Ionia, and thus also take control of the Greek cities on the coast. For the Ionians, this is a decisive moment. But it does not come in the form of a sudden collapse or total destruction. Instead, the power structure is gradually changing. The Persians do not appear as pure destroyers, but as new rulers who establish order and control. They demand loyalty and taxes, but first leave the cities their cultural identity and part of their autonomy. At first glance, little seems to change. Markets remain busy, temples remain at the center of social life, and people go about their daily business. But beneath this surface, something is beginning to shift. Political freedom, which was once a central component of the Ionian cities, is increasingly restricted. It is being replaced by a new system. The Persians use so-called tyrants, local rulers who do not derive their power from the will of the people, but from the support of the Persian authorities. These tyrants are often Ionians, or at least Greeks themselves, but their loyalty is primarily to the great king. They rule in the name of the Persian Empire and ensure that its interests are protected. For the population, this means a profound change. Where decisions used to be made jointly, the authority of an individual now prevails. Political participation is restricted, and the voices of citizens lose weight. The structures of the community continue to exist, but they are no longer the center of power. This change is not immediately visible, but it is noticeable. In conversations in the marketplaces, in the houses and workshops, a slight unease spreads. It is not open resistance, but rather a feeling that something is not the same as it used to be. People are adapting as they have always done, but inwardly their attitude is beginning to change. At the same time, life remains stable in many ways. The Persians do not intervene in every aspect of everyday life. They are interested in the city's functioning, that trade is carried out, and that the taxes flow reliably. As long as these conditions are met, they give the Ionians some leeway. This pragmatic approach ensures that there is initially no immediate cause for open conflicts. But stability does not mean satisfaction. Because the question of freedom and self-determination does not disappear, it is simply pushed into the background. For many Ionians, it remains a central part of their identity. They do not see themselves as subjects of an empire, but as citizens of their own cities. This contradiction between self-image and reality becomes more and more evident over time. Especially the educated and influential classes are beginning to reflect on this discrepancy. They remember a time when their cities were more independent, when political decisions were made together. They compare this past with the present and recognize the differences. This realization does not immediately lead to resistance, but it lays the foundation for later developments. The younger generation is also growing up with these tensions. She knows Persian rule as part of her reality, but at the same time she hears the stories of the older generations. Stories of freedom, of self-determination, and of a time when cities went their own ways. These narratives shape their thinking and influence their view of the present. This creates a complex picture. Ionia is a region full of contradictions. On the one hand, there is the prosperity that comes from trade and cultural exchange. On the other hand, the political dependence on a distant empire. On the one hand, the stability of everyday life. On the other hand, the growing feeling of heteronomy. These opposites coexist without immediately dissolving. But they create a tension that intensifies over time. It is as if a force is gathering under the calm surface, waiting to be released. It is still invisible, it does not yet show itself in open conflicts, but it is there. And that's exactly what makes this phase so crucial. Because it forms the starting point for everything that will follow. The world of the Ionians, as it presents itself at this moment, is not just a background, it is the basis for the coming uprising. Every aspect, every development, every change contributes to creating the conditions under which such a conflict becomes possible in the first place. Everything still seems calm. The ships continue to sail the sea, the markets are filled with goods and voices, and the cities are in their usual splendor. But behind this facade, reality has already changed. And as the Ionians go about their daily lives, a story begins to unfold in secret that will soon extend far beyond their cities. A story of power and resistance, of hope and risk, and of the question of how far people will go when they feel that something they are entitled to has been taken away from them. The world of the Ionians is at the beginning of a radical change. It is not yet visible, but it is inevitable. Chapter 2, Under Persian Rule. At first glance, life in the Ionian cities seems to have changed little. The harbors are still full of ships, the markets are alive, and the temples still attract believers who offer sacrifices to the gods. Traders negotiate loudly about prices, children play in the narrow streets, and craftsmen go about their daily tasks. If you only look superficially, you might think that everything has remained the same. But behind this familiar facade, the power structure has fundamentally shifted. The control no longer lies with the citizens of the cities. But the Persians do not rule directly in every city. Instead, they use a system that is as effective as it is subtle. They install local rulers, so-called tyrants. These tyrants are often Greeks themselves, men from influential families who are familiar with local conditions. This is precisely why they are so valuable to the Persians. They speak the language of the population, know their traditions, and know how to govern a city. But they do not owe their power to the people, but to the support of the Persian authorities. This dependence determines their actions. A tyrant can only hold his position as long as he remains loyal to the Persian Empire. This means that he must put the interests of the great king above those of his own city when it comes down to it. He makes sure that taxes are collected, that order prevails, and that there is no uprising. For the Persians, he is a guarantor of stability. For the population, on the other hand, it is increasingly becoming a symbol of foreign rule. In the past, many decisions were the result of discussions and meetings. Citizens were able to express their opinions, exert influence, and see themselves as part of the community. Now the power is in the hands of an individual. Decisions are no longer made jointly, but announced. Political participation is shrinking, and with it the feeling of being able to help shape one's own city. This change happens gradually. There is no single moment when everything changes. Rather, it is a process that takes place over years. People are getting used to the new order, adapting, and trying to continue their everyday lives as best they can. But underneath this adjustment, a feeling of dissatisfaction grows. They rely on networks of supporters, men who profit from their rule and therefore have an interest in maintaining it. These followers take over important positions, control resources, and ensure that the tyrant's power inside the city is secured. At the same time, they serve as a link between ruler and population, as mediators and sometimes also as supervisors. This creates a system of control. It is not always openly repressive, but it is omnipresent. People know that their actions could be observed, that criticism can have consequences. This uncertainty leads many to keep their opinions to themselves. Conversations are becoming more cautious, trust is becoming more selective, and public life is losing some of its openness. Another decisive factor is the economic burden. The Persian Empire demands tribute payments from the Ionian cities. These taxes are an integral part of the system and serve to finance the empire. For the cities, this means that they have to pay money or goods on a regular basis. To meet these demands, the tyrants levy taxes, often higher than before. But for many ordinary citizens, the burden is being felt. Farmers have to give up part of their harvest, craftsmen part of their income. Life is not becoming impossible, but it is becoming more difficult. And with each levy, the awareness grows that part of one's own wealth flows into a distant center that has no direct connection to one's own everyday life. Nevertheless, there is no open rebellion for the time being. This is mainly due to the power of the Persian Empire. Under rulers like Darius I, the empire is excellently organized. It has an effective management system, a well-developed road network, and a strong army. This combination makes it a formidable force against which individual cities can hardly stand. In addition, there is another problem: the lack of unity among the Ionians. Although they are culturally connected, cities often act independently of each other. Each city has its own interests, its own conflicts and priorities. What is an urgent concern for one city may not play a major role for another. These differences make a common strategy difficult and prevent coordinated resistance from forming. It shifts into the shadows. In private conversations, in small groups, in moments when people are among themselves, thoughts are expressed that would be dangerous in public. Questions arise. Is this rule just? Does it have to be accepted permanently? Is there a way to change it? These questions are vague at first. They do not immediately lead to concrete plans, but they change the perspective. They open up the space for alternatives, for ideas of how things could be different. And that's exactly where their importance lies. Because every big change starts with an idea. Some are beginning to remember the past. A time when their cities had more autonomy, when decisions were made collectively. These memories are not always exact, not always free of transfiguration, but they offer a comparison to the present. And this comparison is often in favor of the previous conditions. These retrospectives also shape the younger generation. Even those who did not experience the time before Persian rule grow up with these stories. They hear about freedom, about self-determination, about a different political order. These narratives influence their thinking and shape their expectations. This creates a growing field of tension. On the one hand, there is the reality of Persian rule with its structures, its stability, and its power. On the other hand, the ideal of freedom and self-determination, which is deeply anchored in the self-image of the Ionians. These two poles are at odds with each other, and this contradiction is becoming more and more apparent over time. The tyrants are also feeling this development. They realize that their position is not without controversy, that their power is not based on real approval. Some react to this with greater control, try to eliminate potential opponents early on and consolidate their authority. Others seek a balance, try to satisfy the population and reduce tensions. But no matter which path they choose, they remain dependent. Dependent on the support of the Persian Empire and at the same time dependent on the stability within their city. This double dependence makes their position insecure. They have to constantly weigh things up, make decisions that do justice to both sides, a task that is almost impossible to fulfill in the long run. Meanwhile, other parts of the Greek world are also watching developments in Ionia. In cities like Athens, interest in the situation is growing. They do not yet intervene, but they perceive that their cultural relatives are under foreign rule. This observation will play an important role later. This creates a complex picture of domination and everyday life. Persian control brings order and stability, but it comes at the expense of political freedom. The tyrants secure power, but they lose legitimacy in the eyes of many citizens. People continue to live, adapt, and at the same time begin to question the existing order. It is a quiet change. No sudden revolution, no open conflict, at least not yet. Rather, it is a process that takes place in people's thinking. A process that takes time, that develops and intensifies. But it is precisely this process that is crucial, because he is preparing the ground for what is to come. He ensures that dissatisfaction can eventually turn into action, that thoughts can become plans. This point has not yet been reached, but the prerequisites for it have been created. The cities of Ionia are under control. But this control is not absolute. It is stable, but not unshakable. And while the Persian Empire is consolidating its power, something is growing within Ionian society that is not so easy to control. A wish. For freedom. For self-determination. For change. This wish is still quiet, but it will become louder. Chapter 3. Aristagoras' Ambition. In a time of growing tensions, in which order appears stable on the outside but begins to crumble on the inside, a figure whose decisions will significantly change the course of history enters the center of events, Aristagoras. He is not a simple man, not an ordinary administrator among many. He is ambitious, politically savvy, and at the same time trapped in a system that gives him power and at the same time makes him dependent. Aristagoras rules over Miletus, one of the most important cities in Ionia. Miletus is not only rich, but also a center of trade, culture, and thought. Whoever is at the top here has influence, not only locally, but far beyond. But this position is anything but certain. Like all tyrants of his time, Aristagoras ultimately owes his power to the support of the Persian Empire. Without this backing, his rule would hardly be conceivable. And that's exactly where his dilemma lies. Because Aristagoras stands between two worlds. On the one hand, It is part of Greek culture, shaped by the ideas of self-determination and political participation. On the other hand, he is a tool of Persian rule, used to ensure stability and enforce the interests of the great king. This dual role forces him to perform a constant balancing act. At the beginning, he seems to have mastered this balancing act. He governs with a mixture of pragmatism and adaptability. He meets the expectations of the Persians, ensures order, and ensures that the necessary taxes are paid. At the same time, he strives to consolidate his position within the city by cultivating relationships and expanding his power structures. To many, he looks like a typical tyrant of his time, neither particularly cruel nor exceptionally just, but above all intent on securing his position. But Aristagoras is more than that. He is a man with ambitions that go beyond the mere administration of a city. He wants influence, recognition, and perhaps even a form of independence, not necessarily for the population, but first of all for himself. These ambitions drive him, make him look for ways to expand his power and strengthen his position. Such an opportunity is offered in the form of a military enterprise. The island of Naxos, rich and strategically important, becomes the target of a planned campaign. Aristagoras sees this as an opportunity to increase his influence and prove himself as a capable leader. But he cannot implement this project alone. He needs the support of the Persians, especially that of a high-ranking commander. So he turns to Artaphernes, the Persian governor in the region. Artaphernes is a representative of the Persian power, a man of authority and resources. Aristagoras convinces him to support the campaign by emphasizing the potential gain, control of a wealthy island, and the expansion of the Persian sphere of influence. The plan is approved. A fleet is assembled, troops are mobilized, and the campaign against Naxos begins. For Aristagoras, this is a decisive moment. Success would not only bring him fame, but also strengthen his position vis-a-vis the Persians. Perhaps he would even gain more independence, more room for maneuver, more control over his own destiny. But the reality is developing differently. The campaign does not go as planned. Internal conflicts, wrong decisions, and a lack of coordination lead to the expedition failing. Naxos cannot be conquered, the siege is unsuccessful, and finally the attackers have to retreat. What was intended as an opportunity turns into a defeat. For Aristagoras, this has serious consequences. He has consumed resources, raised expectations, and ultimately disappointed. His position vis-a-vis the Persians is weakened, his reputation suffers. Even more serious, however, is the fact that he is now in a dangerous situation. As the person responsible for the failure, he must expect consequences, and these could affect his power, perhaps even his life. At that moment, his perspective begins to change. What was previously a game of power and influence now becomes a matter of survival. Aristagoras realizes that he can no longer rely solely on the support of the Persians. On the contrary, this support could turn against him at any time. He is faced with a decision that is more far-reaching than anything he has made so far. He begins to consider an alternative that previously seemed unthinkable, a break with the Persian Empire. The idea of an uprising is not new, but until now it has been abstract, vague, without concrete form. Now it is becoming a real option, not for idealistic reasons, but out of personal necessity. Aristagoras begins to reassess the situation. He realizes that the discontent exists in the Ionian cities. The people are dissatisfied with the Persian rule, with the tyrants, with the restriction of their freedom. This dissatisfaction could become a force, if it is used correctly. What was previously a risk could now become an opportunity. This is how a plan is created. Aristagoras decides to redefine his role. Instead of being a representative of the Persian power, he wants to present himself as the leader of a resistance. He begins to distance himself from the previous order and seek support, both within his own city and beyond. A first step is symbolic and at the same time politically significant. He is laying down his tyrannical rule, at least formally, and trying to establish a new form of government. This step is strategically clever. By freeing himself from the role of tyrant, he positions himself as a representative of the people, as someone who represents the interests of the citizens. But this change is not free of contradictions. Because Aristagoras does not act exclusively out of conviction. His actions are characterized by self-interest, by the desire to save his position and secure his power. For him, the uprising is not only a political project, but also a personal strategy. Nevertheless, his actions have had an impact. His decision sends a signal to other cities. It shows that resistance is possible, that the existing order is not immutable. It gives concrete form to the previously only quietly expressed thoughts. But Aristagoras knows that he cannot walk this path alone. He needs allies, strong allies. The Ionian cities alone will not be enough to successfully oppose the Persian Empire. So he turns his gaze to the west, to the Greek mainland. There he hopes for support from cities such as Sparta and Athens. These cities are independent, militarily experienced, and share a connection to the Ionians, at least culturally. If they succeed in winning them over to the uprising, the balance of power could change. So Aristagoras begins a diplomatic offensive. He travels, negotiates, argues. He portrays the uprising not only as a local conflict, but as part of a larger struggle, a struggle between freedom and foreign rule. In doing so, he cleverly uses common values and identities to gain support. But nothing has been decided yet. His plan is risky, perhaps even desperate. He puts all his eggs in one basket without knowing whether she will win. But for Aristagoras, there is no easy way back. The defeat at Naxos has weakened his position to such an extent that it is hardly possible to stick to the previous system. This is how an ambitious tyrant becomes a leader of an uprising. Not out of pure idealism, but out of a mixture of personal interest, political calculation, and the circumstances in which he has found himself. His story shows how closely individual decisions and historical developments are linked. Because without Aristagoras, there might not have been the uprising in this form. But at the same time, he is not the only trigger. It is part of a larger process, embedded in a world full of tensions, conflicts, and possibilities. His decision is the spark, but the fire has already been prepared beforehand. And now it starts to burn. Chapter 4: The Failed Campaign Against Naxos. At first, the plan seems clear, almost promising. The island of Naxos, located in the heart of the Aegean Sea, is rich, strategically important, and at the same time politically unstable. Internal conflicts have led to the expulsion of some influential citizens. These exiles are now seeking support to regain their power, and this is where an opportunity opens up for Aristagoras. For Aristagoras, this seems to be the perfect opportunity. A successful campaign against Naxos would not only bring him fame, but also strengthen his position against the Persians. He could present himself as a capable leader, as someone who expands and stabilizes the empire. At the same time, he would increase his own influence, perhaps even create new power structures that would make him more independent. But he knows that he cannot implement this project alone. The military resources of his own city, Miletus, are not enough to conquer a well-fortified island. So he seeks support from the Persians. His contact person is Artafernes, who plays a key role in the region as governor. Aristagoras presents him with a plan as a strategic gain. He emphasizes the wealth of Naxos, the possibility of gaining control of an important island, and the chance to expand the influence of the Persian Empire in the Aegean. Artafernes recognizes the potential and agrees. But he goes even further. He not only promises support, but also organizes a comprehensive military expedition. A fleet is assembled. Ships, soldiers, supplies. Everything is being prepared for a campaign that is supposed to be quick and efficient. Responsibility for military leadership rests with a Persian commander, while Aristagoras acts as the initiator and political head of the enterprise. It is a collaboration that is based on common interests, but also carries tensions. Because it is clear from the outset, This is not a purely Ionic company. The Persians are not only supporters, but decisive actors. Their presence changes the dynamics of the campaign. While Aristagoras hopes for personal success, the Persians pursue strategic goals. These different motivations remain in the background for the time being, but they will soon play a decisive role. The expedition begins. The fleet crosses, the troops approach Naxos, and everything seems to be going according to plan. But even at this early stage, the first cracks are appearing. There are tensions between the commanders, differences of opinion about how to proceed. Decisions are questioned, authorities are not always clearly recognized. These internal conflicts weaken the expedition. What was intended as a coordinated attack is developing into an enterprise in which there is disunity. Strategies are not implemented consistently. Communication does not work smoothly. The opponents on Naxos, on the other hand, take advantage of these weaknesses. The island is prepared. The inhabitants of Naxos have learned of the impending invasion and have organized themselves accordingly. They are strengthening their defenses, securing their supplies, and preparing for a siege. Contrary to expectations, the attackers do not encounter an easily overcome city, but a determined resistance. The siege begins. But it drags on. Weeks turn into months, and with every day it becomes clearer that quick success is not forthcoming. The attackers' resources are becoming scarce, morale is plummeting, and internal tensions are rising. What began as an opportunity for fame turns into a liability. For Aristagoras, the situation is becoming increasingly critical. He initiated this campaign, he raised expectations, and now everything threatens to fail. His position is at stake. Because failure means not only a military setback, but also a political one. The Persians could ascribe responsibility to him, question his loyalty, or even depose him. Finally, the decisive moment comes. The expedition is aborted. The attackers retreat without having achieved their goal. Naxos remains independent, and the campaign ends in a clear failure. For those involved, this is more than just a defeat, it is a turning point. The consequences are far-reaching. For the Persians, the failure is a setback, but not an existential one. Their empire is large enough to cope with such losses. For Aristagoras, on the other hand, the situation is different. He is at the center of responsibility, and his position is suddenly uncertain. He recognizes the danger. The support of the Persians, who previously gave him power, could now turn against him. A failed tyrant is of limited use to the realm, and easily replaceable. Aristagoras must expect that his role will be questioned, that he will lose his position, or that there will be worse consequences. In this situation, he begins to rethink. What was previously a calculated game for power is now becoming a matter of survival. Aristagoras realizes that he has to act, and quickly. Sticking to the previous system no longer offers security. On the contrary, it makes him vulnerable. This creates a new perspective. The thought of a break with the Persians, which may have only existed theoretically before, suddenly becomes real. The failure on Naxos has shaken the existing order, not only militarily, but also politically. He has shown that the system is not infallible, that decisions have consequences that cannot always be controlled. For Aristagoras, a risky opportunity opens up. If he loses the support of the Persians, he could try to side with those who are already dissatisfied. The Ionian cities are not free of tensions. The population is not consistently loyal. Perhaps this dissatisfaction can be used and transformed into a movement. But this thought is dangerous. An uprising against the Persian Empire is no ordinary political maneuver. It is an open rupture, a step that can hardly be reversed. Anyone who goes this way puts everything at risk. But for Aristagoras, it increasingly seems to be the only way. The failed campaign against Naxos thus becomes more than just a military episode. It is the trigger for a chain of events that reach far beyond the island. It changes the perspective of a man who suddenly finds himself in a hopeless situation. And it shows how quickly political strategies can turn into existential decisions. At the same time, failure also affects others. It shows that even with Persian support, not every campaign is successful. It reveals weaknesses, internal conflicts, and the limits of military power. For the observers in the Ionian cities, this is an important signal. Perhaps the Persian Empire is not invincible. This idea is still vague, not yet clearly formulated, but it is beginning to spread. And like any new thought, this one has the potential to change existing beliefs. Thus ends the campaign against Naxos, not with a triumph, but with a defeat. But it is precisely in this failure that its significance lies. For it brings movement into a seemingly stable order, asks questions that have not been asked before, and forces those involved to rethink their positions. For Aristagoras, this is the moment of decision. The moment when ambition becomes necessity, planning becomes reaction, adaptation becomes resistance. The path he now takes will determine not only his own fate, but that of many others. Because sometimes it is not success that makes history, but failure. Chapter 5: The Spark of Rebellion. The failed campaign against Naxos has left more than just a military defeat. He sowed doubts, increased insecurities, and above all, put one person in a situation from which there is no easy way out: Aristagoras. What was previously a political calculation is now becoming an existential question. His position is threatened, his relationship with the Persians is shaken, and the future, which once seemed predictable, is suddenly open. In this situation, something begins to change. Aristagoras realizes that the system he has relied on so far no longer offers him security. The support of the Persians, who supported his power, could turn against him at any time. A failed campaign is not only a setback, but a risk, and in an empire like that of the Persians, risks are rarely tolerated. But instead of retreating or trying to appease the situation, he decides to take a different path. A radical path. He begins not only to allow the idea of an open break with the Persian Empire, but to actively pursue it. What may have been a theoretical possibility before is now becoming a concrete plan. Aristagoras realizes that he only has a chance of saving his position if he changes the rules of the game. And so a tyrant becomes an initiator of the rebellion. A first step is as symbolic as it is strategic. Aristagoras gives up his position as tyrant, at least officially. This act is more than just a political decision. It is a signal, an attempt to break away from the old order and present oneself as a representative of the people. By relinquishing his tyrannical power, he seeks to gain trust and present himself as part of a new movement. But this step is not free of contradictions. For Aristagoras does not act out of pure idealism. His motives are complex, characterized by self-interest, fear, and political calculation. Nevertheless, his decision has an effect that goes beyond his personal motives. It sets something in motion. In Miletus and other Ionian cities, the news spreads quickly. A tyrant who gives up his power and calls for resistance. That is unusual, almost revolutionary. It is a break with the previous order, a sign that change is possible. The reactions are different. Some are skeptical about this step. They wonder whether Aristagoras really represents the interests of the population, or whether he is simply trying to save his own skin. Others, on the other hand, see him as an opportunity, a leader willing to take the risk of an uprising. And it is precisely this risk that is enormous. An uprising against the Persian Empire means opposing one of the most powerful forces in the world at the time. It's not a local conflict, it's not a limited power struggle, it's a challenge to an empire. Anyone who participates in this is not only putting their position at risk, but their lives. But despite this danger, support is beginning to form. The dissatisfaction that has built up over the years is now being expressed. Conversations become more concrete, thoughts become plans. The idea of an uprising, which previously existed only in secret, now comes into the light. Aristagoras uses this dynamic. He begins to actively promote the rebellion. He talks to influential citizens, seeks support in other cities and tries to build a network. In doing so, he draws on a central element, the common identity of the Ionians as Greeks. He presents the conflict not only as a political one, but also as a cultural one. The Persians are foreign, in their language, their customs, their way of life. The Ionians, on the other hand, share a common origin, a common culture. This connection becomes an important argument for gaining support. Aristagoras appeals to the feeling of belonging, to the awareness of being part of a larger community. But he knows that words alone are not enough. An insurgency needs more than just approval. It needs organization, coordination, and above all, military strength. The Ionian cities must work together, join forces, and develop a common strategy. This is not an easy task, because the cities are not always in agreement. Rivalries, different interests, and local conflicts make cooperation difficult. Each city has its own priorities, its own concerns. Some are reluctant to embark on such a risky path. Others see the rebellion as an opportunity to improve their position. Despite these differences, Aristagoras succeeds in setting a movement in motion. The first cities are following suit, and others will follow. The tyrants are overthrown or expelled, and new forms of government take their place. It is a process that is not the same everywhere, but it shows that something fundamental is changing. The control of the Persians begins to crumble. It is not yet broken, but it is no longer unchallenged. The insurrection is no longer an isolated act, but a movement that is spreading. With every city that joins, the momentum grows. But at the same time, the danger is also growing. The Persian Empire will not stand idly by. It will react, and this reaction will most likely be harsh. Aristagoras and his comrades in arms know this. They know that they are getting involved in a conflict whose outcome is uncertain. And yet they go this way. Perhaps because they see no alternative. Perhaps because the hope for change is stronger than the fear of the consequences. Perhaps also because once developments have been set in motion, they can no longer be stopped. The spark has been ignited. What began as an individual decision develops into a collective event. Rebellion is no longer just an idea, but reality. It is changing the political landscape of Ionia, questioning existing power relations, and forcing all parties involved to take a stand. This does not go unnoticed outside of Ionia either. Developments are observed, analyzed, and evaluated. Interest is growing, especially in cities like Athens. It is still unclear whether and how they will intervene, but the events in Ionia raise questions that extend far beyond the region. In this way, a local uprising becomes a potentially larger conflict. A conflict that affects not only the relationship between Ionians and Persians, but also the entire Greek world. The boundaries between local and super-regional interests are beginning to blur. For Aristagoras, this is the moment when everything is decided. He dared to take the step, opposed the Persian Empire, and initiated a movement that can no longer be stopped. But whether this movement will be successful is uncertain. The path he has taken is full of risks, and there is no easy way back. The spark of rebellion has ignited, and now the fire begins to spread. Chapter 6: The Search for Allies. The uprising has been ignited, but its foundation is still fragile. The Ionian cities have risen, the tyrants have been overthrown or expelled, and a first courageous step has been taken. But it quickly becomes clear that resistance alone will not be enough. The power of the Persian Empire is too great, its resources too extensive, its ability to react too solid. If the uprising is to last, it needs more than determination, it needs allies. This realization is at the center of Aristagoras' next decision. He knows that the Ionian cities can hardly survive militarily alone. Even if they join forces, they lack the necessary strength to survive against the Persian Empire in the long term. The uprising must be carried beyond Ionia. It must become a common concern, a conflict that affects not only one region, but the entire Greek world. So the view is directed to the west. There are the large city-states of mainland Greece, independent, battle-hardened and proud of their autonomy. Cities such as Sparta and Athens are potential allies. They share language, culture and religious traditions with the Ionians. But whether this common identity is enough to drag them into a dangerous war is uncertain. Aristagoras decides to act himself. He leaves Ionia and embarks on a diplomatic journey, a step that is as courageous as it is risky. Because while he is on the road, the uprising is left without his direct leadership. But the prospect of support outweighs this risk. His first destination is Sparta. Sparta is considered one of the most powerful military forces in Greece. His warriors are disciplined, his society geared towards combat and order. If Sparta can be won over to the uprising, the balance of power could change decisively. Aristagoras appears before Cleomenes I, the king of the Spartans. He describes the situation in Ionia, describes the oppression by the Persians and emphasizes the common identity of the Greeks. He argues that intervention would not only help the Ionians, but would also be in Sparta's interest. Because if the Persian Empire continues to expand, it could also threaten the Greek mainland at some point. To support his arguments, Aristagoras goes even further. He tries to emphasize the attractiveness of a campaign, speaks of riches in the east, of possibilities that could open up through victory. It is a mixture of strategic considerations and temptations that he uses to convince Cleomenes. But his arguments are met with resistance. Cleomenes listens, asks questions, and remains skeptical. For Sparta, a campaign into Asia Minor is an enormous undertaking. The distance is great, the risks are high, and the benefits are uncertain. Unlike Aristagoras, Cleomenes sees not only the opportunities, but above all the dangers. When Aristagoras describes the length of the journey to the Persian heartland, the decision becomes clear. For Cleomenes, the effort is too great, the risk too high. Sparta rejects the support. Despite all his efforts, Aristagoras fails at this first stop on his journey. This rejection is a setback. Sparta would have been a powerful ally, perhaps even the decisive factor in the success of the uprising. Without this support, the situation remains difficult. But Aristagoras does not give up. He turns to another destination, Athens. In contrast to Sparta, Athens is a city in transition. The political structure has changed, new forms of participation are emerging, and the self-image of citizens is evolving. Athens is more open to new ideas, perhaps also more receptive to the arguments of a man like Aristagoras. Again he presents his request. He speaks of the oppression of the Ionians, of their common origins, of the necessity of standing up against an overpowering foreign rule. But this time he meets a different audience, one that thinks differently, decides differently. In Athens, the people have a voice. The decision on possible support is not made by an individual ruler, but by the community. Aristagoras must therefore not only convince, but inspire. He must convince the Athenians that this conflict is also their conflict. And this time he is successful. Athens decides to support the uprising. It is not overwhelming aid, not a massive military intervention, but it is a start. A fleet is provided, ships and men are sent to support the Ionian cities. This step is of great importance, not only because of the direct help, but also because of the signal effect. Athens opposes the Persian Empire, a clear signal that goes far beyond the concrete mission. It shows that the uprising is not isolated, that it finds support. The city of Eretria also joins in. Together, Athens and Eretria send a small but symbolically important force to Ionia. For Aristagoras, this is a success, perhaps not the big breakthrough he had hoped for, but a decisive step. But with this support, the dimension of the conflict is also growing. What began as a regional uprising is now turning into a dispute in which the Greek mainland is also involved. The boundaries of the conflict are expanding, and with them the consequences. Because the Persian Empire will not ignore this development. Athens' participation is more than just military support, it is a provocation. It shows that Greek cities are prepared to openly oppose the Reich. This challenge will provoke a response, and this response will not be limited to Ionia. For the Ionian cities, the support means new courage. They see that they are not alone, that their cause is also attracting attention outside their region. This realization strengthens their determination, gives them the feeling of being part of something bigger. But at the same time, the situation remains uncertain. Aid from Athens and Eretria is limited. It is not enough to fundamentally change the balance of power. The uprising remains a risky undertaking, the outcome of which is uncertain. Aristagoras has partially achieved his goal. He has found allies, internationalized the uprising, and laid the foundation for further developments. But the price for this is high. The conflict has reached a new dimension, and the consequences will be far-reaching. The search for allies has changed the uprising. It is no longer just a local resistance, but part of a larger event. The connection between Ionia and the Greek mainland is strengthened, and with it the idea of a common cause. But this connection also brings new risks. Because the bigger the conflict becomes, the greater the reaction of the Persian Empire will be. Athens' decision to intervene will not be without consequences. And so the uprising is at a new point. He is stronger than before, but also more exposed. He has gained support, but also attracted attention. The next steps will be decisive. Because now the moment has come when preparation becomes action. And the world begins to watch. Chapter 7. Athens intervenes. The decision has been made, and it changes everything. When Athens decides to support the Ionian Uprising, the conflict crosses an invisible border. What was previously a regional resistance to the rule of the Persian Empire is now becoming a matter that affects the entire Greek world. It is a step that has not only military but above all political significance. Because Athens is not acting lightly. The city itself is in a phase of upheaval. The old power structures have changed, new political forms are emerging, and the self-image of the citizens is evolving. Freedom, codetermination, and independence are no longer abstract concepts, but lived reality, at least compared to many other regions. This is precisely why the situation in Ionia has a particularly urgent effect on the Athenians. People live there who speak the same language, worship the same gods, and see themselves as part of the same cultural community, and yet are under foreign rule. The reports about tyrants, political oppression, and control by the Persian Empire resonate in Athens. When Aristagoras steps in front of the Athenians, he meets an audience that is receptive. He describes the situation not only as a political conflict, but as a question of freedom and identity. He speaks of their common origins, of their responsibility towards the Ionian cities, and of the danger posed by the Persian Empire. His words fall on fertile ground. But the decision is not a matter of course. Intervention means risk. It means taking on a powerful empire whose resources and military strength far exceed those of individual Greek cities. It also means tying up forces that might be lacking elsewhere. And yet Athens decides to take the step. A fleet is provided, 20 ships, manned by soldiers ready to go into a conflict whose outcome is uncertain. It is not an overwhelming force, but it is a clear sign. Athens is positioning itself, taking a stand and showing that it is willing to act beyond its own borders. Eretria also joins in. Together, the two cities are sending their forces to Ionia. The ships cross the Aegean Sea, carrying men, weapons, and expectations with them. For the Ionian cities, their arrival is a moment of hope, visible proof that their uprising is gaining support. When the Athenian and Eretrian troops arrive in Ionia, the mood changes. The rebellion is gaining new momentum, new energy. The idea of not standing alone strengthens the insurgents' determination. At the same time, self-confidence grows. If cities like Athens are prepared to oppose the Persian Empire, then resistance no longer seems hopeless. But this new dynamic also brings challenges. Coordination between the different forces is not easy. Different interests, different experiences and different expectations must be reconciled. The Ionian cities have their own structures, the Athenians bring their own ideas. Nevertheless, it is possible to formulate a common goal. A goal that goes beyond mere defense, the attack on the Persian center of power in the region. The choice falls on Sardis, the capital of the Persian administration in Asia Minor. This plan is daring. An attack on Sardis means directly hitting the heart of Persian control in the region. It is a step that requires courage, and at the same time sends a clear signal. The insurgents not only want to survive, they want to change the balance of power. Preparations begin. Troops are gathered, strategies are developed, paths are planned. The presence of the Athenian forces plays a decisive role in this. They bring not only additional military strength, but also new impetus. Their participation shows that the conflict has taken on a larger dimension. Finally, the joint army starts moving. The troops marched inland, leaving the coastal regions and advancing into an area firmly under Persian control. The path is not easy, but the determination is great. When they reach Sardis, the decisive moment comes. The city is attacked, the defense surprises. The insurgents manage to penetrate the city. For a brief moment, it seems as if the bold plan is succeeding. But then something unexpected happens. A fire breaks out. Whether it is intentional or caused by the fighting is unclear, but the consequences are devastating. The flames spread quickly, spread to buildings and engulfed large parts of the city. Sardis, the symbol of Persian power in the region, is in flames. This moment has enormous symbolic power. He shows that Persian control is not sacrosanct. He sends a signal to the insurgents and to the Persian Empire. But it also has consequences that go beyond immediate success. Because the fire changes the situation. Control over the city is lost. The situation becomes confusing. The insurgents cannot maintain their advantage. Persian troops gather, organize the resistance, and begin to fight back. The situation is tipping. What started as a success develops into a retreat. The insurgents leave Sardis, retreat, and try to organize their forces. The attack has shown what is possible, but also how quickly the tide can turn. For the Athenians, this will be a turning point. They realize that the conflict is more complex than expected, that the risks are greater than they might have thought. After withdrawing, they decide to end their support and return home. This decision has far-reaching consequences. For the Ionian cities, it means a loss of support, a setback in an already difficult battle. For the Persian Empire, on the other hand, it is a clear signal. Athens has interfered, and is now perceived as an opponent. Darius I in particular takes note of this development. Athens' participation will not be forgotten. It becomes a factor influencing future decisions, a reason why the conflict is spread beyond Ionia. Thus, Athens' intervention marks a decisive moment. It intensifies the uprising, gives it new energy, and at the same time attracts greater attention. It shows that resistance can find support, but also that this support cannot be taken for granted. The situation remains difficult for the Ionians. They have gained an important ally, and lost it again. They have achieved a success, and have not been able to hold on to it. But despite these setbacks, something has remained. The realization that resistance is possible. That even the heart of the Persian power can be struck. That an empire is not invulnerable. This realization will remain. And it will shape the further course of the uprising. Chapter 8. The March on Sardis. The decision to advance inland is more than just a military step. It is a statement. The Ionian insurgents and their allies from Athens and Eretria have realized that simply defending their cities will not be enough. If the uprising is to have a real chance, it must become visible, palpable, and above all, it must directly challenge the power of the Persian Empire. The destination is clear: Sardis. Sardis is not only a city, but the administrative center of Persian rule in Asia Minor. This is where Artaphernes, the governor of the great king, sits, where political and economic threads come together. An attack on Sardis is an attack on the structure of Persian control itself. The plan is daring, perhaps even bold. But that's exactly where his strength lies. Such an attack is unexpected. The Persians do not expect the insurgents to venture so far inland. This surprise could bring the decisive advantage. Preparations begin. Troops from various Ionian cities are gathering, reinforced by the contingents from Athens and Eretria. It is a diverse army, united by a common goal, but shaped by different backgrounds and experiences. Coordination is not easy, but determination prevails. The march begins. The armed forces are leaving the coastal regions and moving into the interior of Lydia. The path leads through unknown terrain, far away from the familiar ports and cities. Each step takes them further away from the safety of their homeland and brings them closer to the center of Persian power. The landscape is changing. The open coast gives way to hilly terrain, roads become narrower, paths more confusing. But the troops are advancing, carried by the hope of a decisive blow. Conversations among the soldiers reflect a mixture of tension and expectation. Many know that they are part of something significant, even if they don't know the outcome. As they approach Sardis, the tension rises. The city lies in front of them, fortified but not prepared for an immediate attack. The surprise is on her side. The insurgents took advantage of this advantage, launched an attack and penetrated the city. For a moment, the plan seems to be working. The defenses are taken by surprise. The streets of Sardis are filled with fighting, shouting, and movement. The insurgents gain the upper hand, control parts of the city. It is a moment of triumph, proof that their courage was not in vain. But this moment is fragile. In the midst of the fighting, something happens that no one can fully control. A fire breaks out. It remains unclear whether it is triggered by fighting or deliberately planted. But the effect is immediate. The flames spread quickly. Sardis is a city with many buildings made of highly flammable materials. The fire finds food, spreads from house to house, is carried on by the wind. Within a short time, large parts of the city are in flames. The situation is getting out of control. What began as a military success turns into chaos. The insurgents lose track and have to deal not only with the Persian defenders, but also with the unstoppable spread of fire. It is a catastrophe for the inhabitants of Sardis. Houses are burning, people are fleeing, property is being lost. The city, which is considered a symbol of the Persian order, becomes the scene of destruction. This sight will be deeply engraved in the memory of those involved. This moment also has great significance for the Persians. The fire is not only a physical destruction, but also a symbolic one. It shows that even the center of their power is vulnerable. But at the same time, it triggers a decisive reaction. The Persian troops are gathering. Under the leadership of Artaphornes, they reorganize their forces, take advantage of the disorder of the insurgents and begin to fight back. The attackers' initial advantage is dwindling. The situation is tipping. The insurgents realize that they cannot maintain control of the city. The fire, which at first may seem to them as a sign of their success, now becomes an obstacle. It makes their movements more difficult, separates units from each other, and makes coordinated defense impossible. The retreat begins. Step by step, the troops withdraw from Sardis, leave the burning city and try to regroup. The march, which began with hope and determination, ends in an orderly but forced retreat. But the attack has left its mark. Sardis is damaged, the symbol of Persian power shaken. News of the attack spreads quickly, in Ionia, on the Greek mainland and in the Persian Empire itself. Everyone interprets this event in their own way. For the insurgents, it is a mixed result. They have shown that they are capable of hitting the heart of Persian control. But they could not maintain this success. The price is high, and the long-term consequences are uncertain. For the Athenians, this moment will be particularly formative. They have participated in an attack that will have far-reaching consequences. The experience in Sardis shows them the reality of this conflict, its complexity, its dangers, its unpredictability. This realization will influence their future decisions. For the Persian Empire, the attack is a provocation. A direct attack on Sardis cannot go unanswered. Darius I in particular will not ignore this development. Athens' participation is registered. The destruction of Sardis is not forgotten. Thus, the march on Sardis becomes a turning point. It marks the moment when the uprising reaches its greatest extent, and at the same time begins to meet with stronger resistance. The insurgents have taken the initiative, but now the reaction of the Persian Empire will follow. The attack showed what is possible, but also how quickly a success can turn into a challenge. The flames of Sardis are more than just a fire. They are a symbol of courage, of risk, and of the unpredictable consequences of decisions. And as the city slowly burns out, the conflict begins to move into a new phase. A phase in which the empire's response becomes inevitable. Chapter 9: Fire and Retribution. The flames of Sardis have long since been extinguished, but their effect has remained. What began as a daring attack has burned itself deeply into the memory of all those involved, not only as a military event, but as a symbol. For the Ionian insurgents, Sardis stands for courage and the possibility of shaking even the center of Persian power. For the Persian Empire, on the other hand, it is a provocation, an attack that cannot go unanswered. Especially for Darius I, this event has a personal dimension. The great king rules over an empire of enormous expanses, characterized by order, structure, and authority. An attack on Sardis is not just a local incident, it is a challenge to his power. The news of the destruction reaches him and triggers a reaction that will reach far beyond Ionia. Darius realizes that this is not an isolated rebellion. The involvement of Athens has taken the conflict to a new level. For the first time, a city on the Greek mainland is actively intervening in the affairs of the Persian Empire. This step will not be forgotten. For Darius, it is clear, those responsible must be held accountable. This is how the phase of retribution begins. The Persian Empire does not react impulsively, but in an organized and systematic way. Troops are mobilized, strategies are developed, and control over the affected regions is strengthened. The rebellion should not only be suppressed, but used as a deterrent example. For the Ionian cities, this means a new reality. The initial euphoria triggered by the attack on Sardis gives way to growing tension. People know that the Persian response is imminent, and they also know that this reaction will be harsh. The question is no longer whether the empire will strike back, but when and how. In many cities, people are starting to prepare. Defenses are reinforced, supplies are collected, strategies are discussed. But the options are limited. The Ionian cities do not have the resources of an empire. They have to improvise, work together, and hope that their determination is enough. At the same time, the first cracks within the movement are appearing. Not all cities are equally willing to bear the consequences of the uprising. Some begin to doubt. Others consider whether a return to Persian rule would not be the safer way. The unity that would be crucial for the success of the uprising is becoming increasingly fragile. The Persian Empire takes advantage of this weakness. It is not only military, but also strategic. Loyalties are tested, alliances are questioned, individual cities are put under targeted pressure. The message is clear: anyone who resists will be punished. Those who submit can count on leniency. This strategy is having an effect. In some regions, resistance is crumbling, in others it is weakening. The insurgents no longer only face an external opponent, but also have to deal with internal tensions. But determination is not giving way everywhere. There are cities and groups that continue to believe in the uprising, that are willing to bear the risks. For them, the attack on Sardis is proof that change is possible, even if the price is high. The Persian counteroffensives begin. Troops move through the region. capture strategically important points, and try to restore control step by step. They are not uncoordinated attacks, but part of a larger plan aimed at systematically isolating and crushing the insurgency. The situation is becoming increasingly difficult for the insurgents. They must not only defend themselves, but also maintain their own structures. Communication becomes more difficult, coordination more complicated. Every loss, every defeat weakens their position. At the same time, the memory of Sardis continues to have an effect. For the Persians, it is a reason for determination, for the Ionians a symbol of hope. This double significance makes the event so central to the further course of the conflict. But hope alone is not enough. The reality of the war is becoming increasingly clear. Loss, destruction, and uncertainty characterize everyday life. The people who may have previously been only indirectly affected are now feeling the consequences of the uprising directly. The role of Athens is also changing in this context. After the Athenian troops have withdrawn, their participation nevertheless remains a decisive factor. For the Ionians it was a sign of support, for the Persians a reason for retaliation. Athens is now part of the conflict, whether active or not. Darius does not lose sight of this detail. The memory of Athens' participation becomes a motive that influences future decisions. The conflict will not be limited to Ionia, that is becoming increasingly clear. This creates a new dynamic. The uprising is no longer just an attempt to regain one's own freedom. It has become part of a larger conflict that is spreading across regions. The boundaries between local resistance and super-regional conflict are becoming blurred. For Aristagoras and the other leaders, the situation is becoming increasingly complex. They have to make decisions that not only have short-term effects, but also affect the entire course of the uprising. Every step can mean success or defeat, progress or setback. But the room for maneuver is getting smaller. With every Persian countermeasure, the possibilities of the insurgents shrink. The initiative they won with the attack on Sardis is increasingly being lost. The conflict is shifting from an offensive approach to a defensive struggle. And yet the resistance remains. Despite all the difficulties, despite all the losses, there are still people who are not willing to give up. For them, the uprising is more than just a political event. It is an expression of a fundamental need for self-determination. But this need is now facing a reality that is becoming increasingly harsh. The retaliation of the Persian Empire is not only military, but also psychological. It is not only intended to end the uprising, but also to prevent future rebellions. The message is clear: resistance has consequences. Thus, the fire of Sardis becomes a turning point. It has made the uprising visible, given it meaning, and at the same time triggered a reaction that threatens its existence. The flames have not only changed a city, but the entire course of the conflict. A new phase is now beginning for the Ionians. A phase in which it is no longer about the beginning of the rebellion, but about its survival. A phase in which it will become clear whether the spark that has been ignited is strong enough to stand up to the forces of an empire, or whether it will slowly go out. Chapter 10. The Turn of the War. The first months of the uprising were marked by movement, courage, and the feeling of being able to change something. The attack on Sardis had shown that even the structures of a huge empire could be shaken. But this phase is now behind the Ionian cities. The war enters a new decisive stage, one in which the balance of power increasingly shifts in favor of the Persian Empire. At the center of this development is once again Darius I. For him, the uprising has long been more than a regional unrest. It is a challenge to the authority of the entire empire. Darius does not react impulsively, but with strategic clarity. He relies on organization, on a systematic approach, and on the sheer strength of his empire. His goal is clear: the complete restoration of control, and a signal to all regions that resistance will not be tolerated. The Persian counteroffensives are increasing in intensity. Troops are being pulled together from different parts of the empire, experienced commanders are taking the lead, and military operations are being carefully planned. Unlike at the beginning of the uprising, when the reaction was delayed, the Persians are now acting in a coordinated and determined manner. For the Ionian cities, this means a drastic change. They are no longer faced with an isolated opponent, but with a structured military machine. The attacks are targeted, often against strategically important points. Cities are isolated, connections are interrupted, supply lines are disrupted. The war is being waged systematically. The insurgents are increasingly on the defensive. What was previously an active approach is now becoming a fight for survival. The opportunities to take one's own initiatives are shrinking. Instead, cities must concentrate their forces on repelling attacks and holding their positions. At the same time, the internal tensions intensify. The initial unity that carried the uprising is beginning to crumble. Different interests are becoming more prominent. Doubts are getting louder. Some cities are wondering whether the resistance still makes sense. Others continue to hold on to it. This disunity weakens the movement. Coordinated actions become more difficult, decisions are delayed, and trust between those involved decreases. In a conflict that requires cooperation, this development becomes a serious problem. The Persian Empire recognizes this weakness and uses it. It relies not only on military strength, but also on political strategy. Individual cities are specifically addressed, confronted with offers or threats. The message is clear: those who submit can expect lenient treatment. Those who continue to resist must expect harsh consequences. This strategy is having an effect. In some regions, resistance is beginning to subside, while in others it is becoming more cautious. The clear front that existed at the beginning of the uprising is becoming increasingly blurred. Loyalties shift, decisions become more difficult. For the leaders of the uprising, the situation is becoming increasingly complex. They have to make not only military decisions, but also political ones. They must keep their allies together, build trust, and at the same time respond to the growing threat. Every decision becomes a balancing act. The role of Aristagoras also changes during this phase. The man who initiated the uprising is now facing the consequences of his decision. His position is no longer that of an initiator, but that of a leader in an increasingly difficult situation. Expectations are high, the pressure is growing. But the reality of war leaves little room for easy solutions. The Persian troops gain ground, reconquer lost territories, and restore control step by step. Every success of the Persians further weakens the position of the insurgents. Another decisive factor is the military superiority of the Persian Empire. It has greater resources, more soldiers, and a better logistical structure. While the Ionian cities can use their forces to a limited extent, the Persian Empire can compensate for losses and continuously strengthen its army. This asymmetry is becoming increasingly clear. It may have been less visible at the beginning of the uprising, but as time goes on, it becomes more and more prominent. The war will be decided not only by courage and determination, but also by resources and organization. And in these areas the Persian Empire has clear advantages. For the population of the Ionian cities, the war is increasingly noticeable. What may have previously been perceived as a political event is now becoming a reality of everyday life. Fighting, destruction, and insecurity characterize life. The effects of the conflict are no longer abstract, but concrete. This development also influences the mood. Hope is increasingly giving way to worry. Confidence is being replaced by doubt. People are beginning to weigh the costs of the uprising, and these costs are high. Nevertheless, there is still resistance. Not everyone is ready to give up. There are cities and groups that stick to their goal despite all the difficulties. For them, the uprising is more than just a political project. It is a question of identity. But this determination faces a reality that is increasingly turning against her. The turning point of the war is not a single event, but a process. A process in which the balance of power shifts slowly but steadily. Every step, every battle, Every decision contributes to this. The memory of previous successes also changes. The attack on Sardis, once seen as a sign of strength, now appears in a different light. It remains an important moment, but it cannot stop current developments. For the Persian Empire, on the other hand, this moment becomes a driving force. It strengthens the determination to end the uprising once and for all and to send a clear signal. The reaction will be not only military, but also symbolic. Thus, the war reaches a point where its direction is clearly visible. The initiative no longer lies with the insurgents. They react, defend, try to hold on to what they still control. The Persian Empire, on the other hand, increasingly determines the course of events. But despite this development, the outcome has not yet been finally decided. There are still possibilities, still opportunities, even if they have become smaller. The story is not yet over, the conflict is not yet over. But one thing is clear. The war has changed. What began as an uprising has now become a struggle against a superior power. A fight that will show whether determination and courage are enough to stand up to organization and strength, or whether the turn of the war marks the beginning of the end. Chapter 11: The Collapse of the Alliance. At the beginning of the uprising, it seemed as if the Ionian cities had achieved something they had long lacked: unity. Despite their differences, their rivalries, and their individual interests, they stood together against an overpowering external force. It was this alliance that gave the uprising a real chance in the first place. But unity is a fragile commodity, and the longer the conflict lasts, the more clearly the cracks become apparent. With the turn of the war, this unity begins to disintegrate. The military successes of the Persian Empire, the increasing burden of the war, and the growing insecurity led the Ionian cities to reassess their situation. What initially seemed like a common goal is now viewed from different perspectives. Some cities are beginning to doubt. They ask themselves whether the uprising still has a chance of success, whether the victims are justified, and whether it would not be wiser to look for another way. The memory of the initial euphoria fades, replaced by the reality of a long and costly conflict. Others, on the other hand, continue to hold on to resistance. For them, a retreat is not an option. They see the uprising not only as a political decision, but as a question of honor and identity. To submit would be to give up everything they have fought for. These different attitudes lead to tensions. Talks between cities are becoming more difficult, decisions are delayed, and trust is beginning to crumble. Where there was previously a common goal, individual interests now come to the fore. A particularly critical factor is the question of responsibility. Who is to blame for the current situation? Was the uprising doomed to failure from the start, or were mistakes made that could have been avoided? Such questions are not openly asked, but they are present, and they influence the behavior of those involved. The role of Aristagoras is also increasingly being questioned. The man who initiated the uprising is now at the center of criticism. His decisions, his strategies, and his motives are discussed. Some continue to see him as a leader, others are beginning to see him as part of the problem. This development weakens the leadership. An insurrection that does not have a clear, recognized leadership loses direction. Decisions become more difficult, coordination more difficult. In a conflict that requires quick and decisive action, this is a serious problem. At the same time, the Persian Empire deliberately exploits this situation. Under the leadership of Darius I, not only military but also political action is taken. The Persians understand that a divided alliance is easier to defeat than a united one. They are relying on a strategy that aims to further weaken the alliance. Individual cities are specifically addressed. They are offered conditions under which they can rejoin the Persian Empire, often combined with the prospect of milder treatment or the receipt of certain privileges. At the same time, other cities are confronted with military pressure. This combination of offer and threat is having an effect. Some cities are beginning to withdraw from the alliance or at least reduce their support. Others are becoming more cautious, hesitating in joint actions or holding back. This creates a situation in which the alliance still formally exists, but in fact loses strength. Joint actions are becoming less frequent, less coordinated, and less effective. The ability to act as a closed unit is dwindling. Another factor exacerbates this disintegration: geographical distance. The Ionian cities are spread over a longer coastal region. Communication is not always easy, especially in times of war. News takes time, misunderstandings arise, and coordination is made more difficult. These structural problems are now becoming more apparent. What was still manageable in times of relative stability becomes a burden under the pressure of war. The coordination of troops, the planning of joint actions, and the coordination of strategies are becoming increasingly difficult. Resources also play a role. The war has weakened the cities. Supplies are limited, economic activities are restricted, and the burden on the population is growing. Each city must decide how to use its resources, and these decisions do not always align with the needs of the alliance. This is how the trend towards independence is increasing. Cities are beginning to weigh their own interests more heavily, to pursue their own strategies, and to orient themselves less towards common plans. What began as an alliance is increasingly developing into a loosely connected group of individual actors. This development has a direct impact on military events. Without clear coordination, it becomes more difficult to respond effectively to the Persian attacks. Chances are missed, positions are lost, and the initiative remains with the opponent. This decay is noticeable for the population. Uncertainty is growing. Confidence in the success of the uprising is declining. People are beginning to wonder whether the path they have taken was the right one, and whether there is still a way to stabilize the situation. But with every day, this possibility becomes smaller. The collapse of the alliance is not a sudden event, but a gradual process. A process that is made up of many small decisions, many individual perspectives. And therein lies his tragedy. Because the Ionian cities had the chance to change something together. They had the courage to stand up to an overpowering force. But without lasting unity, this courage alone will not be enough. The Persian Empire, on the other hand, benefits from this development. It no longer has to fight against a united front, but can concentrate on individual goals. Every break in the alliance, every disagreement, every delay plays into his hands. In this way, the balance continues to shift. The uprising loses strength, while the control of the Persian Empire increases again. The dynamic that was so powerful at the beginning is weakening, and yet a remnant of cohesion remains. Not all cities give up, not all are ready to submit. There are still attempts to stabilize the alliance, develop common strategies, and maintain resistance. But these attempts are under a difficult omen, because trust, once lost, is not easy to restore. And without trust, any form of cooperation is fragile. So the uprising is at a critical point. It is not only the external threat from the Persian Empire that determines its outcome, but also the internal stability of the alliance. The disintegration of this alliance could prove to be a decisive factor, because sometimes it is not the strength of the opponent that decides the outcome of a conflict, but the ability to stick together. Chapter 12: The Battle of Ark. The war has come to a head. The forces of the Ionian cities are weakened, their alliance fragile, and the Persian counteroffensive is gaining strength. In this tense situation, the focus is on a place that will decide the further course of the uprising, the island of Lade, located off the coast of Miletus. Everything should be decided here. Because while the Persians gather their troops and continue to advance their strategy, the Ionians realize that they have to strike a decisive blow if they still want to have a chance. Control over the sea becomes the key. Those who control the sea not only control movements and supplies, but also the possibility of blocking the enemy or attacking themselves. In this way, the fleet becomes the center of hope. The Ionian cities mobilize their ships, call together their allies, and prepare for a major naval battle. It is a huge undertaking. Numerous cities are participating, providing ships and crews. For a moment, it seems as if the old unity is regrouping, carried by the realization that only joint action can save the uprising. The fleet gathers at Lade. The island becomes a rallying point, a strategic center of defense. From here, the Ionians want to stop the Persian fleet before it reaches Miletus. The mood is tense, but also determined. Everyone knows that this is a crucial moment. But beneath the surface, the problems remain. The unity that is visible on the outside is fragile on the inside. The tensions between the cities have not disappeared, the doubts have not been dispelled. Differences in experience, discipline, and motivation characterize the fleet. Some contingents are well organized, others less so. Some crews are experienced in combat, others are hardly prepared. These differences will not be without significance in a decisive battle. Attempts are being made to discipline the fleet. Some leaders recognize the danger and try to train the crews, improve their cooperation, and create clear structures. But these efforts are not universally approved. Discipline requires sacrifice, time, and trust, and that's exactly what is lacking at this moment. The Persian fleet is approaching. It is numerically strong, well organized, and supported by experienced commanders. But the Persians are not only relying on military strength. They are also resorting to a strategy that has already proven effective on land. They are trying to undermine the Ionian alliance. Messages are sent. Individual cities are addressed. They are offered conditions under which they can withdraw or change sides. The Persians are deliberately exploiting the existing tensions, trying to stir up distrust and break the unity of the fleet. This strategy is having an effect. The doubts that previously existed in the background are now coming to light. Some contingents are beginning to hesitate, others are questioning their participation. Talks are held, decisions are weighed up, and not always in the sense of the common cause. As the battle begins, this becomes visible. The fleets meet, the first maneuvers are carried out, and the tension discharges into movement and battle. But even in the early phases, it became clear that the Ionian fleet was not acting as a unit. Some units are withdrawing. Others hesitate, do not attack decisively, or stay out of the fight. What was planned as a common defense disintegrates into individual, uncoordinated actions. The consequences are serious. Without a united front, the Ionians lose the advantage they could have had through their position and their preparation. The Persian fleet takes advantage of this weakness, attacks in a targeted manner, and increasingly gains control. The fight becomes chaotic. Ships collide, maneuvers fail, orders do not reach all units. The lack of coordination leads to individual contingents being isolated and coming under pressure. Nevertheless, there is resistance. Some cities are fighting resolutely, trying to turn the tide of the battle or at least stand firm. But their use is not enough to stabilize the overall situation. Persian supremacy prevails. Step by step, they gain the upper hand, drive back the Ionian ships, and secure control of the battlefield. The defeat of the Ionians is inevitable. This is a heavy blow for those involved. The naval Battle of Lade was the last great hope of saving the uprising. With their defeat, this hope collapses. Control of the sea is lost, and with it the possibility of effectively defending Miletus. The consequences are immediate. Without the fleet, the city is vulnerable. The Persian troops can now approach unhindered, prepare for the siege, and continue to implement their strategy. But the significance of Lade goes beyond the immediate consequences. The battle clearly shows that it is not only military strength that determines the outcome of a conflict, but also unity and trust. The Ionians had the opportunity to act together, but they were not able to take full advantage of this opportunity. For the Persian Empire, the victory is a decisive step. It strengthens their position, secures their control over the region, and paves the way for the next step, the capture of Miletus. For the Ionian cities, it is a moment of disillusionment. The reality of war becomes visible in all its severity. The hopes that carried the uprising are overshadowed by the defeat. And yet the memory remains. The Battle of Ark will go down in history not only as a defeat, but also as a moment when the fate of the uprising was decided. A moment that shows how crucial unity can be, and how fatal its absence is. The flames of Sardis had sparked the uprising. The turn of the war had weakened him. But Lade brings him to the brink of collapse. Because after this battle, there is hardly any room for hope. Only time left, and it is running out. Chapter 13, The Fall of Miletus. After the devastating defeat in the naval Battle of Lade, the fate of the Ionian cities is sealed. Control of the sea, the backbone of their defenses, is lost, and the Persian troops advance inexorably. One city in particular is now at the center of the action, Miletus. It was the heart of the uprising, the starting point of Aristagoras' political ambitions, and now it threatens to fall under Persian control as the last stronghold of the rebellion. The news of Lade hits Miletus with full force. The population is shocked, the military leaders at a loss. Many now realize that defense against the Persian Empire is hardly possible. The city, once proud of its independence and prosperity, is on the brink of disaster. The walls can still hold, but the morale of the citizens and soldiers is shaken. Despair mixes with fear, and the reality of the impending attack is unmistakable. Aristagoras, the man who initiated the uprising, faces his greatest challenge. He must decide how to defend the city, organize the troops and motivate the population, all under conditions that seem increasingly hopeless. The responsibility weighs heavily on his shoulders. He is no longer only a political leader, but also a military commander and symbolic figure for the resistance. Every decision he makes can save or cost lives. Every action decides the survival of the city and the future of the rebellion. The Persians approach strategically and methodically. Under the command of experienced commanders, the Persian Empire uses the knowledge from Sardis and Ark to systematically encircle Miletus. Troops march in from several sides, besiege the city, cut off supply lines, and begin to weaken the defenses. The Persians know that a direct attack is risky, but they use pressure, isolation, and psychological tactics to get the city to give in. There is a tense atmosphere within Miletus. The citizens are preparing for the siege. Supplies are collected, walls are reinforced, strategic points are occupied. But resources are limited. Hunger, fatigue, and the fear of the imminent attack weigh heavily on everyone. Children are sent away, women and the elderly try to find shelter, while men stand against the walls and wait for the inevitable. Aristagoras tries to maintain morale. He speaks to the citizens, reminding them of the common goals, of the courage of the Ionians, and of the hope that could still exist. But even his words cannot completely dispel the growing despair. Everyone knows that the situation is precarious, that time is working against them. The siege begins. The Persians used siege techniques that they had previously tested in other regions. Catapults, stormtroopers, and tactical blockades force the city onto the defensive. The walls are holding, but the pressure is growing every day. The besiegers completely isolate Miletus and prevent supplies from other cities. Hunger and disease are spreading, while tension rises within the walls. Fighting becomes inevitable. Skirmishes at the city gates, skirmishes on the city walls, smaller attacks that test the defenses. All this exhausts the defenders and shows the tactical superiority of the Persians. Each attack costs lives, resources, and strength, but the city holds out, as long as it can. But the inner unity of the city begins to crumble. The ongoing strain of the siege is creating tensions between citizens, soldiers, and leaders. Mistrust grows. Some begin to consider betrayal, others despair. The unity that originally supported the uprising threatens to break up here and now, even before the external enemy can overcome the walls. The psychological pressure of the Persians is enormous. They know about the importance of Miletus as the center of the uprising. Through targeted threats, propaganda, and demonstrations of their strength, they try to demoralize the defenders. Rumors are spread, negotiations are conducted, promises are made, all to undermine the city's resilience. Nevertheless, the defenders are putting up fierce resistance. They know about the symbolic power of their city. Miletus is not just a city, it is the heart of rebellion, the hope for all Ionians. Every moment they hold out is a sign of steadfastness, a symbol that resistance is possible, even under the greatest pressure. But the pressure is growing incessantly. The city's resources are becoming scarce, the number of defenders is decreasing, and the constant tension is draining body and mind. Diseases are spreading, hunger and exhaustion are weakening people. Every decision becomes more difficult, every moment a fight for survival. Then comes the decisive moment. After weeks of siege, the Persians decide that a direct attack is necessary. Siege engines are positioned, assault troops are provided. The defenders know that this is the critical phase, the moment that decides between life and death. The attack begins. Shields collide, swords meet swords, arrows pierce the air. The walls tremble under the pressure of the siege engines. The defenders fight with all their might, but the superiority of the Persians is overwhelming. It is a struggle that demands everything physically, psychologically, and emotionally. Finally, the defense breaks. After tireless resistance, the Persians succeed in finding gaps, overcoming the walls, breaking through the city. Control of Miletus falls into their hands. The city, once the heart of the uprising, has fallen. The consequences are devastating. Buildings are destroyed, populations are killed, deported or displaced. The symbol of rebellion has been destroyed. The hope that Miletus represented is hit hard. For the Ionians, this is a turning point that drastically reduces the possibility of successful resistance. But the story of Miletus remains in the memory. The steadfastness, courage and willingness to sacrifice of the city characterize the memory of the uprising. Even though the city has fallen, it remains a symbol of the attempt to resist an overpowering empire. The events of Miletus become legendary, a memorial to courage, but also to the consequences of defeat. For Aristagoras, this is a moment of failure. His initiative, the uprising itself, has ignited a symbolic spark, but it is now extinguished under the pressure of the Persian power. The responsibility for the case of Miletus rests heavily on his shoulders. Decisions once made out of courage and ambition have put the city on the defensive, and the consequences are inevitable. Persian control is now final. With the capture of Miletus, the Persian Empire restores order in Ionia. The tyrants are installed or confirmed, taxes are demanded, rebellions are severely punished. The message is clear, resistance has consequences, and the power of the empire is unbroken. But despite the destruction, a spark remains. The memory of Miletus, of the hope, of the courage of the Ionians, remains alive. It will not be forgotten, neither in Ionia nor on the Greek mainland. The lessons learned from the siege shape future generations and influence the way Greeks and Persians understand the relationships between freedom, power, and rebellion. Thus, the fall of Miletus ends not only as a military event, but as a symbol of the courage to rise up against an overpowering power, of the harshness of war and retaliation, of the limits of unity and the price of defeat. Miletus has fallen, but his story is carried on, as a warning, as an inspiration and as a testimony to a rebellion that put all its eggs in one basket. Chapter 14: The Consequences for Ionia. With the fall of Miletus, the rebellion was finally broken and Persian rule over Ionia was restored. But the effects go far beyond military victory. The uprising, which once symbolized hope, courage, and unity, has left deep traces in the population, in the political structure, in the economy, and in the collective memory of the Ionians. This chapter is dedicated to the diverse and long-term consequences that the uprising had for the region. At first, the destruction shows itself in tangible form. Many cities were damaged or looted in the course of the uprising. Miletus in particular, as the heart of the rebellion, lies in ruins. Houses, temples, and public buildings have been destroyed, trade and infrastructure are paralyzed. The population is decimated, many people have been killed, abducted, or are fleeing to other regions. The economic foundations that once made Miletus a center of trade and culture have been permanently shaken. But the destruction is not only physical. The political structure of cities is changing fundamentally. The Persian Empire relies on the restoration of its control through the installation of loyal tyrants and governors. Democracy or participatory forms of government that previously existed in some cities are being pushed back or completely abolished. The political autonomy of which the Ionians were once proud is massively restricted. Decisions are now again dictated centrally from the outside, and the influence of the citizens is minimal. At the same time, social structures are changing. The population is experiencing a phase of mistrust, fear, and loss of control. After the uprising, there is increased surveillance by the tyrants and their followers. Every deviation, every criticism is closely observed. People are learning to be careful, weigh their words, and avoid public protest. The sense of community that had been strengthened during the uprising is beginning to wane. Mistrust and self-protection dominate daily life. Another key effect concerns the economy. The uprising had disrupted trade routes and economic relations. Many traders have ceased their activities or fled to safer areas. Ports that were previously the backbone of prosperity are in ruins or are blocked. The Persians now control tax revenues and duties more closely, further restricting the economic freedom of the cities. It will take years for trade and production to return to their old proportions. But the consequences are not only negative. Despite the destruction and oppression, a new political and social dynamic is beginning to develop in some cities. The experience of the uprising, the fall of Miletus, and the brutal reaction of the Persians shape the way people look at their future. Many are learning to think more strategically, to rethink alliances, and to make political decisions more carefully. The lessons of defeat lead to an adjustment of local leadership and a differentiated approach to power and resistance. The uprising has also left its mark culturally. The rebellion of Ionia is told and remembered in the Greek world. Stories of courage, willingness to sacrifice, and resistance against Persian superiority are passed on, first orally, later in writings and chronicles. The uprising inspires others to think about freedom, political participation, and the role of cities in a great empire. The memory of the uprising shapes the self-image of the Ionians and becomes a point of reference for later generations. At the level of foreign policy, the perception of Ionia is also changing. Greek cities on the mainland are watching the events closely. The participation of Athens and Eretria in the uprising, limited as it was, shows them that it is possible to oppose the Persian Empire, and that there are great risks involved. Experience teaches them that unity is crucial, that betrayal and internal tensions jeopardize success, and that rebellion against a strong empire requires careful planning. These findings have a significant influence on Greece's future policy towards Persia. The psychological consequences are profound. The Ionians have experienced how quickly hope, courage, and unity can be shattered by the superiority of an empire. The case of Miletus clearly shows that individual and collective action has limits. This experience has a long-term impact on the awareness of the population. Many learn to think more pragmatically, weigh up risks, and realistically assess their own possibilities. Fear, mistrust, and caution are becoming formative elements of social life. The lessons of the insurgency also influence the military organization. The Ionians realize that a fragmented and poorly coordinated fleet makes victory impossible. The defeat at the Battle of Ark and the subsequent fall of Miletus clearly demonstrate the importance of unity, strategic planning, and resource management. Future generations will take these lessons into account when forging military or political alliances. Despite everything, the cultural and intellectual power of the region is preserved. The cities of Ionia were and are centers of philosophy, science, and trade. The destruction of war affects the material world, but ideas, knowledge, and cultural achievements are not so easily erased. Schools, thinkers, and philosophers continue their work, even if they are now under tighter control. The experience of the uprising becomes part of the collective identity, a chapter of history that is both cautionary and inspiring. The long-term consequences of the uprising are complex. Militarily, politically, economically, and culturally, it is changing the region permanently. The Persians have demonstrated their power, the Ionians have experienced their limits, and the Greek world is learning from these events. The uprising has shown how risky resistance to a powerful empire can be, but also that courage, unity, and strategic action can bring about change in the short term. In the coming years, Ionia will remain under Persian control. The cities are reorganized, tyrants are confirmed or appointed, duties and taxes are fixed. The memory of the uprising remains alive, but the reality of submission is harsh. People must learn to live under foreign rule, to conserve their resources, and to accept political realities. But in the subconscious, the flame of rebellion remains. The stories of Miletus, of Sardis and of Lade are continued. They shape the self-image of the Ionians and provide lessons for future generations. The uprising, as failed as it may have been, leaves traces that go far beyond the immediate consequences. This shows that the uprising of the Ionians was more than a military event. It was a test of unity, courage, and political imagination. He showed the limits of individual and collective agency, made the strategies of an empire visible, and shaped the perception of freedom and submission. Even after the defeat, it remains a turning point in the history of Ionia, a moment that carries both the tragedy of defeat and the power of resistance. The consequences for Ionia are extensive. Destruction, oppression, economic decline, and political control characterize the immediate reality. But culturally, psychologically, and historically, the experience remains deeply rooted. It shapes the thinking, strategies, and self-image of the people in the region for generations. The uprising has shown that action is possible even against an overpowering empire, but that unity, planning, and foresight are crucial for success. Miletus may have fallen, the rebellion may have failed, but the lessons and memories of the uprising will not be erased. They will live on, in stories, in philosophy, in the collective idea of what it means to fight for freedom and self-determination, even in the face of overwhelming power. Chapter 15: The Legacy of the Uprising. The revolt of the Ionians against the Persian Empire is over. The cities have fallen, Miletus lies destroyed, Sardis has been burned, and Persian rule has been restored. At first glance, the rebellion seems to have been a clear failure, a brief outcry against an overpowering empire that ultimately did not bring about lasting change. But a closer look shows that the events had an impact far beyond the military outcome. The uprising leaves a legacy that extends to political, cultural, military, and psychological levels, shaping the region, the Greek world, and the perception of power for generations to come. First of all, there is the political lesson. The Ionians have learned that unity is crucial. Its initial strength lay in the cooperation of the cities, in the coordination of the fleets, and in the cohesion of the population. But disintegration, disunity, and individual interests ultimately led to defeat. This experience leaves a clear message: resistance to a superior power requires not only courage, but also organization, trust, and strategic alignment. The lessons of Ark, Sardis, and the case of Miletus are not forgotten. They serve as a reminder to later generations that fault lines within an alliance can often be more dangerous than the external enemy. The military dimension of heritage is equally significant. The Ionians have shown how quickly a well-prepared, numerically superior fleet can be defeated when coordination is lacking. The naval Battle of Lade is told in the Greek city-states as a prime example of how crucial discipline, strategy, and leadership are. These findings are later incorporated into military planning. Cities learn that a mere number of ships or soldiers is no guarantee of success. Tactics, training, and cooperation are decisive. The uprising is also used as a lesson on the Persian side. The administration of a far-reaching empire requires both military power and psychological control and diplomacy to prevent uprisings at an early stage. Culturally, the uprising leaves an equally lasting effect. The stories of Miletus, Sardis, and Lade are recorded by chroniclers, philosophers, and later historians. They are more than just reports of struggles and defeats. they become stories about courage, ambition, betrayal, and hope. The Ionians had shown that even small towns can rebel against the superiority of an empire, even if the result is tragic. These stories shape the Greek idea of freedom and resistance. Philosophers and readers refer to the events as an example of how collective action and courage take on political and moral significance. The psychological impact on the population is profound. The Ionians have experienced the cruelty of an empire, but also felt the power of their own actions. Generations that have heard these stories grow up with an awareness of risk, loyalty, and consistency. The uprising teaches that freedom is precious, that the loss of unity can have fatal consequences, and that political decisions must not be made without responsibility. At the same time, awareness of the possibility of resistance remains alive, even if the means are limited and the consequences can be severe. Economically, the uprising also leaves its mark. The sieges, the fighting, and the destruction of cities have disrupted trade routes, destroyed markets, and destroyed wealth. But these economic challenges also lead to long-term adjustments. Cities learn to make trade relations more resilient, to store supplies strategically, and to reduce economic dependencies. The lesson is clear: war can destroy the foundations of prosperity, so cities must act resilient and forward-looking if they are to survive. The role of Aristagoras becomes ambivalent in this legacy. He was the spark that ignited the uprising, the man whose ambition and initiative brought the Ionian cities together and created a moment of hope. But his mistakes, his miscalculations, and his personal motivation led to the movement ultimately breaking up. Aristagoras is later seen as a cautionary tale. Leaders can provide inspiration and mobilization, but without strategic foresight, insight into the limits of one's own power, and the ability to unite allies, even the most courageous initiative can fail. The Greek world on the mainland observes and learns. The involvement of Athens and Eretria in the uprising is carefully analyzed. Athens' troops were unable to prevent defeat, but experience shapes future decisions: when and how to intervene in conflicts, how to select and coordinate allies, and the importance of rapid responses in times of war. The lessons from Ionia had a long-term effect, especially in the decades leading up to the Persian Wars, when the Greek city-states once again faced Persia. The Persian side is also learning lessons. Darius I and his generals recognized the importance of rapid, targeted retaliation, control of alliances, and the psychological dimension of war. The uprising shows that not only brute force, but also diplomacy, intimidation, and political manipulation are necessary to keep such a large empire stable. The oppression of the Ionians is becoming a model for how uprisings can be handled in the future: harsh but calculating, with clear messages to other regions. On a human level, heritage is complex. For the survivors who were able to flee Miletus and other cities, a new phase of life begins. Many are uprooted, lose their homes and possessions, and have to integrate into new cities or regions. Their experiences shape the way they understand politics, loyalty, and community. Stories of destruction, betrayal, and steadfastness are passed on to the next generation, a living testimony to the costs and risks of resistance. Religious and cultural structures are also influenced. Temples, sanctuaries, and cultural centers have been destroyed, but religious practices continue. The Ionians seek support in their gods, explain defeats as trials, and use rituals to process the trauma. At the same time, new forms of collective remembrance are emerging: festivals, commemorative events, and narratives that embed the uprising in the cultural identity of the region. The long-term geopolitical implications are significant. Although the uprising failed militarily, it drew the attention of the Greek world to the strength and strategy of the Persian Empire, to the need for alliances, and to the risks involved in resisting such a powerful empire. These experiences will influence decisions, alliances, and warfare in the coming decades. The Ionian Revolt becomes a point of reference as Greeks reflect on freedom, risk, and political planning. Psychologically, the uprising also shapes the idea of power. He shows that empires appear vulnerable when there is courage and initiative, but that they are overwhelming when internal weaknesses and disunity arise. The history of the uprising becomes a lesson that is discussed in schools, assemblies, and later historical analyses. It teaches that both individual leadership and collective organization are crucial, and that mistakes can have fatal consequences on both levels. Last but not least, the uprising leaves a moral dimension. He becomes a legend that raises questions about justice, loyalty, duty, and sacrifice. The Ionians fought even though the odds were slim, and they showed that courage and idealism exist, even when reality is merciless. The legacy of this rebellion is therefore not only a story of defeat, but also of human courage and political responsibility. This shows that the end of the uprising is not the end of its meaning. The destruction of cities, the punishment of the population, and the restoration of Persian rule only mark the end of the military. Culturally, politically, and psychologically, the uprising lives on. It shapes the understanding of freedom, strategic planning, military cooperation, and the price of rebellion. Generations of Ionians, Greeks, and Persians learn from the events, about courage and loss, about pride and adaptation, about the opportunities and limits of human agency. The legacy of the uprising is evident in memory. It is a reminder of the possibilities of resistance, of the risks of disunity, of the importance of leadership, unity, and strategic foresight. Miletus, Sardis, Ark, they become symbols, not just for defeat, but for what people can fight for if they don't give up hope, even in the face of overwhelming power. And although Ionia is now under control, the idea lives on. The rebellion has shown that resistance is possible, that freedom has a value that can be defended, and that decisions, courage, and strategy determine life and death, success and failure. This legacy shapes not only the region, but the entire Greek world, which will later revolt against Persia again. Thus, the Ionian Uprising does not end as a mere episode of history. It leaves traces that have an effect for generations: military, political, economic, cultural, and psychological. His legacy is multi-layered. It is a story of courage and failure, of unity and disintegration, of risk and responsibility. The Ionians may have been defeated, but the lessons they leave behind shape the world and remind us that even in defeat there is a significant impetus for the future.